off my tarmac right now!
Check the flight logs.
That was Captain Maverick on that channel.
There's a very specific kind of embarrassment that only happens once in most people's lives, if they're lucky. And it happens when you say something loud and confident and completely wrong in front of a lot of people, and you find out you were wrong within about 90 seconds of saying it. That's exactly what happened to a senior flight line supervisor on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday morning when he saw a young-looking woman walking toward a restricted section of runway and yelled in front of an entire ground crew, "Hey, get off the runway, kid, this isn't a tour!" 90 seconds later, that same man was standing completely still, listening to his own radio identify her by a call sign that made 3 veteran controllers go quiet at the exact same moment. If you love stories about assumptions getting demolished in real time, hit subscribe before we go any further, because that is genuinely the entire heartbeat of this channel. And tonight, I want you playing along with me. At some point in this story, you're going to start suspecting what ghostwriter actually means before I tell you. When that happens, stop and drop your guess in the comments. I want to know exactly where in the story it clicked for you. Let's go back to the beginning, because the whole weight of this story lives in just how ordinary that Wednesday morning looked, right up until it didn't. Her name, for tonight's story, was Captain Nora Ibarra, 29 years old, and she'd arrived at that base that morning for what was, on paper, a low-key logistics visit, coordinating some cross-unit paperwork ahead of a joint exercise scheduled for later that month. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that should have drawn a second glance from anyone. She was dressed casually, out of uniform, having flown in on a transport flight rather than arriving with the kind of formal escort that usually signals "important person" to the people working a flight line. And that detail, small as it sounds, turned out to matter more than anyone expected. The man who yelled at her that morning was a senior flight line supervisor named Master Sergeant Tom Reddick, a man who'd run that particular section of runway for the better part of 11 years, and who took security around active flight operations about as seriously as anyone on that base. In fairness to him, and I do want to be fair here, because I don't think this story works if we turn him into a cartoon villain, Reddick's instincts weren't unreasonable in the abstract. Unfamiliar civilian-dressed person, walking with purpose toward a section of active runway, no visible escort. That's exactly the kind of thing a good flight line supervisor is trained to notice and challenge immediately. What went wrong wasn't the instinct to stop her. It was the tone. Reddick, seeing a woman who looked, in his own words used later, like she could have been somebody's daughter visiting for career day, didn't approach the situation with the neutral caution his training called for. He approached it with a kind of dismissive, almost amused confidence, the tone of someone who's already decided, before he's said a word, exactly how unserious this interruption is going to turn out to be. And so, in front of a ground crew of maybe a dozen people, he yelled across the tarmac, loud enough that everyone working nearby turned to look. "Hey, get off the runway, kid, this isn't a tour!" I want you to sit in that moment with me for a second, because I think there's something universally recognizable about it, even if you've never been anywhere near a military runway in your life. Have you ever been dismissed, loudly, publicly, by someone who was completely confident in a judgment they'd made about you in about 2 seconds? Hold on to that feeling. We're going to come back to it very soon. Nora, according to 3 witnesses who were close enough to see the whole exchange, didn't flinch, didn't raise her voice, didn't even really change expression. She simply stopped walking, turned toward Reddick, and said calmly, "I have clearance to be here. You're welcome to verify it." No sharpness in her voice, no performance of offense, just a flat, steady statement of fact, delivered by someone who had clearly, at some point in her life, learned that the fastest way through a moment like this is to let the facts do the talking rather than her own emotions. Reddick, according to those same witnesses, wasn't fully satisfied by that. He radioed it in anyway, partly out of genuine procedure, and partly, if I'm honest, out of a lingering confidence that whatever came back over that radio was going to confirm exactly what he already assumed: an unauthorized visitor who needed to be walked off that runway before anything went further. What none of them knew, standing there on that tarmac that morning, was that Nora Ibarra had spent the better part of the previous 7 years building one of the more quietly remarkable flying careers in her particular specialty, a career centered around low-altitude, high-risk precision flight operations, exactly the kind of flying that demands an almost unnatural steadiness under pressure and an even more unusual tolerance for operating in conditions most pilots are trained specifically to avoid. She'd flown missions that, for reasons that had nothing to do with secrecy for its own sake and everything to do with the operational sensitivity of the work itself, simply never came up in casual conversation, the kind of missions that exist in a service record without ever making their way into the stories people tell each other over coffee. She'd earned her call sign years earlier, the way these things always seem to happen in these stories, not chosen, but given, after a specific mission that left a lasting impression on the people who witnessed it. During an extraordinarily demanding, low-visibility operation, flying a route that required threading her aircraft through terrain and conditions that, by every reasonable estimation, should have made the mission impossible to complete safely, Nora had executed with a level of precision and nerve that one of the pilots flying alongside her that day described afterward as like flying next to something that wasn't entirely bound by the same rules the rest of us were. The name that stuck, half in awe and half as a genuine joke about how impossibly smooth she made an impossible flight look, was Ghost Rider. Because watching her fly that day, more than one witness said, felt like watching someone who genuinely wasn't quite there in the way the rest of them were, present, but somehow moving through danger like it simply couldn't quite touch her. None of that traveled with her onto that tarmac. All Reddick saw that morning was an unfamiliar young woman in civilian clothes, and the entire weight of that reputation, 7 years in the making, sat completely invisible behind a face that, to him, just looked like it belonged somewhere else. The radio call Reddick made that morning, routine as he expected it to be, went out to base security for identity verification, and came back considerably faster than he anticipated, with considerably more urgency in the responding voice than a routine visitor check usually generates. According to the ground crew standing nearby, the security controller on the other end of that radio didn't just confirm her clearance. He said her name, and then, almost immediately afterward, said her call sign out loud, the way you say something you genuinely can't quite believe you're saying in this specific context. Ghost Rider is confirmed. Captain Ibarra has full base clearance. Stand down. I want you to picture Reddick's face in that exact moment, because according to 2 people who watched it happen, it did something that several of them still bring up when they tell this story. It wasn't just surprise. It was the specific, sinking recognition of someone realizing, in real time, that the loud, confident thing he'd just yelled across an entire flight line was about to become a story that outlived him on that base for a very long time. What made the moment land even harder, according to witnesses, was what happened over the radio in the following few seconds. 2 other controllers, apparently overhearing the confirmation, chimed in almost immediately, their voices carrying the specific tone of people who clearly knew exactly who Ghost Rider was, even if nobody standing on that tarmac that morning had ever heard the name before. One of them, according to a ground crew member standing close enough to hear it clearly, said simply, "Wait, the Ghost Rider? She's here?" With an enthusiasm that made unmistakably clear this wasn't just a routine clearance check. This was someone with a reputation that reached considerably further than that single base. Reddick, according to every account gathered afterward, didn't say much in the immediate aftermath. He apologized, according to one witness, quickly and a little stiffly, the specific kind of apology that comes from someone who's still catching up to how badly they misjudged a situation. Nora, for her part, accepted it with the same understated calm she'd shown through the entire exchange, telling him, according to that same witness, that his instinct to stop an unfamiliar face wasn't wrong in itself, and that she appreciated him taking security seriously, even if the delivery had needed some work. That grace, honestly, is part of what makes this story land the way it does for me. Nora wasn't interested in humiliating him further than the moment already had on its own. She didn't need to. The radio had already done that for her, completely, in about 15 seconds, without her having to say a single additional word. Word of what happened on that tarmac spread through the base fast, the way stories involving a senior supervisor getting very publicly, very quickly proven wrong tend to spread. By that afternoon, according to several people who described the mood on base that day, Nora Ibarra had gone from a complete unknown to easily one of the more talked-about visitors on the entire base that week, with pilots and ground crew alike suddenly curious about the mission history behind a call sign that, up until that morning, had existed mostly as a name whispered in specific circles rather than something openly discussed. Nora herself handled the sudden attention the way she seemed to handle most things, which is to say, quietly and without much interest in leaning into it. When a couple of curious younger pilots approached her later that day, hoping to hear more about the mission that had earned her that call sign, she gave them a fairly brief, understated version of events, clearly more interested in getting through her actual paperwork visit than in becoming, for a day, the most interesting person on that base. Reddick, for his part, according to people who worked with him in the following weeks, became noticeably more careful in how he approached unfamiliar faces on that flight line, a shift several of his own crew members noted with a mixture of amusement and quiet approval. He never fully lived down the moment, in the sense that it became one of those stories that gets retold, gently, at his expense, for years afterward. But by most accounts, he took it the way you'd hope someone in his position would take it, as a genuinely useful, if embarrassing, lesson about the gap between what someone looks like they might be and what they actually are. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the 15 seconds it took for that radio to demolish Reddick's assumption, satisfying as that moment undeniably is. It's the years before it. Years of Nora Ibarra quietly building one of the more remarkable flying reputations in her entire specialty, doing work sensitive and demanding enough that almost none of it ever made its way into casual conversation, and walking through the world, most days, looking exactly like someone who could be mistaken for a visitor on career day. She never needed anyone to recognize her on sight. Her work had already done that, permanently, among the specific community of people who actually understood what it meant. It just took one loud, careless assumption on an ordinary Wednesday morning to remind an entire base of exactly what that work had earned her. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think Reddick's instinct to challenge an unfamiliar face was reasonable, even if his tone clearly wasn't? Or do you think the whole approach, tone included, reflects a deeper habit of assuming young women simply don't belong in certain spaces until proven otherwise? And tell me the other thing too. Before the radio said it out loud, had you already started suspecting what Ghost Rider was going to turn out to mean? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly these moments. The loud, confident assumption, and the 15 seconds it takes to completely fall apart. And if you've got a story like this one, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and quite a few of the stories on this channel started exactly there. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.